Russia, sleeping with the enemy. This is Mark Millardi, and this is Unprecedented. Any fan of the seminal 1970s television show The Brady Bunch remembers the line, "Russia, Russia, Russia!" Actually, it was Marsha, 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 but I'm here to talk Russia today. A little history lesson. Russia's been in the news endlessly, as we've seen, for months and months and months and months. Let's talk a little bit about Russia. Let's go back in history and look at Russia from a grand historical perspective. In the business world, which I've been in for many years now, over 30 years, whenever someone presents a business plan that is very grandiose, that's very strategic, very far-reaching in scope, in a business plan that's really overreaching, someone in the room, invariably, someone in the conference room, and it's usually the oldest person in the room, the most seasoned person in the room, will say, "Wait a minute, that plan is like invading Russia. What are you trying to do, invade Russia?" What they mean by that is Russia is a country, and at a time was an empire, that is absolutely vast in scope, both in terms of its size, its sheer landmass, the percentage of the globe that it covers, as well as in terms of its population, its people, the diversity of nationalities, of languages, of religions, and the physical sprawl of the population of Russia is like nothing else in the world. Over the course of centuries, a variety of foreign powers have attempted to conquer Russia. Most recently, from a historical perspective, the Napoleon's empire, the French Empire under Napoleon, tried to conquer Russia, and then more recently, in the last century, we had the German army, World War II, the Nazis under Adolf Hitler. In both cases, Napoleon's instance and Hitler's instance, they made tremendous progress in invading Russia in a very short space of time, a very short period of time. For all intents and purposes, it looked as if Russia would be overrun in a matter of months, literally, by the French and German armies respectively. Well, as it turned out, that's not at all what happened. Mother Russia, as Russia likes to refer to itself, reasserted itself, and in both instances emerged victorious after protracted, bloody, lengthy battles with the invading armies. Russia itself, here's an example. World War II, where we were allied with Russia, as well as with Britain, France, and the other allied powers, it's somewhat heretical to say this perhaps, but it's a fairly safe bet that had it not been for the profound sacrifices of the Russian army, the Russian armed forces, and the civilian population of Russia during World War II, that war may have been won by the Germans, perhaps, or the war could have devolved to a stalemate, in essence, and a negotiated peace. The suffering of Russia and the manpower that Russia put forth, the massing of the civilian population in World War II was unparalleled in the history of the world. By the end of World War II, Russia had somewhere between 8 million and 12 million men and women under arms in defense of Mother Russia. The sacrifices were enormous. We don't really know what the exact number was, but history tells us by the best accounts we have available that something on the order of 20 million Russian civilians died in World War II. They literally massed the Russian Empire in defense of Mother Russia. Some specific battles, as examples, there were 3 pivotal battles in World War II that bear some examination here. One is the Battle of Stalingrad. Stalingrad was the, if you will, the keynote city within Russia at that point in time. And it had the name of Stalin, Joseph Stalin, the leader of Russia. Therefore, Russia was going to defend Stalingrad at all costs. A protracted battle went on for Stalingrad. It went on literally for months and months. The Russians slowly but surely ground down a massive German army, repelled them, encircled them, and it was, I believe, the largest number of German prisoners of war throughout the entire course of World War II were suffered in the Battle of Stalingrad. That was one pivotal moment. There were 2 others, the Battle of Kursk, which to this day is the largest tank battle, the largest battle of armor, land armor, in the history of warfare between the Germans and the Russians. Again, the Russians emerged victorious. And last but not least, and the most painful episode of all, the city of Leningrad, which is in the far northwestern reaches of Russia, was besieged by the Germans for 3 years, for 900 days. They attempted to starve the population into submission. The Germans encircled Leningrad, literally and figuratively, kept all food and provisions and reinforcements out for 900 days. And even with that, the Russians still wouldn't surrender the city, ultimately got reinforced, broke through, encircled the Germans, and emerged victorious. So you look at those examples where Russia has been pushed to the limit historically. By any measure, they appeared to be defeated. The tide of battle appeared to have gone in the favor of, in one century, the French, in another century, the Germans. Mother Russia emerged victorious. Now, from the standpoint of America's alliance with Russia, we were allied with Russia, as I mentioned earlier, in both World War I as well as World War II. Despite our competing political ideologies and the vast differences between the democracies of the Western world, including the US and Russia, we aligned with them. It was very much the situation of the enemy of my enemy is my friend. So we fought alongside the Russians, again, to victory in each of those instances. So with that as the backdrop, and then projecting forward, based on that history of Russia, in many instances, being alone against the world, being isolated, and having to fight back, left to its own devices, against superior enemy forces time and again, and a history of having been invaded on numerous occasions over the centuries, Russia, based on that history, today continues to have a psychology that's very much rooted in paranoia, in distrust, suspicion, defensiveness regarding the motivations of the rest of the world. In particular, Russia looks down upon all of the surrounding countries. Russia itself borders on many countries, and quite a few of the countries they border on are companies that used to be part of what was previously the Soviet Union, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, which was the Russian Communist Empire, if you will. So all of those states who were once vassal states of the USSR broke free after communism, after the Berlin Wall fell and communism was defeated in Russia in 1991. A lot of those states became free states, free countries with their own governments. Russia maintains an animosity towards those states and a bitterness over the fact that those states were ripped out of their empire. In addition, the US, the United States, being the traditional Cold War enemy of Russia, and having on numerous occasions bested Russia in that regard, Russia harbors a lot of resentments against the U.S. and against, again, certainly all the Western democracies, and as well the countries that used to be part of their empire back in the day. So with that as the backdrop, in comes Vladimir Putin, the president of Russia in the here and now. Vladimir Putin spent his career as a senior member of the KGB, the Russian Secret Service in essence. Think of them as the German Gestapo. They were the Russian secret police for all intents and purposes. Vladimir Putin's role as part of the KGB was in intelligence, counterintelligence operations, putting down dissidents, suppressing anti-Soviet, anti-Russia protests and demonstrations of that nature. That's what he was involved in all those years. He was a principal member of that KGB hierarchy. In recent years now, with Vladimir Putin having been in place in Russia now as president for quite some time, Russia has made a lot of overtures to in essence, reestablish its empire, to reclaim the republics that used to be part of the old USSR. And some very timely examples of that, within the past several years, they've militarily intervened and then annexed Crimea. Crimea used to be part of the USSR. In essence, the Russians, against the wishes of the people of Crimea, have reoccupied Crimea and brought it back into the Russian orbit. Another example is Ukraine, which again used to be part of the old USSR, broke away after 1991, had its own independent government. Russia in recent years has intervened militarily in Ukraine and has again attempted to annex at least part of Ukraine. They've also made overtures, threats against Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, which are the Baltic countries that again used to be part of the USSR, and Russia looks upon them as, we want to bring them back into the fold, if you will. And last but not least, a very pertinent example, Russia has intervened in a big way militarily in Syria, and they have supported the regime of Bashar al-Assad, who has documented, human rights abuses. There's a civil war that's been going on in Syria for a number of years, and Russia is an active supporter of Bashar al-Assad's regime. They've backed him militarily, helped suppress his own people, and literally tens of thousands of people have been killed in the warfare that's ensued from that. So with all of that, let's fast forward now to the here and now. Over the past 18 months approximately, Donald Trump and his administration have given every indication of a willingness to embrace Russia, of a desire to reestablish and normalize relations between the United States and Russia. The theory of it all being, at least according to what Trump and his folks have said publicly, is that together we can be stronger than we are individually. That together we can battle ISIS, we can battle extremism, we can battle radical Islamic strains in the world more effectively as a unit than we can individually. And on the surface of it, you think, okay, interesting. It couldn't hurt if Russia and the U.S. were friends. On the surface of it, you think, okay, that's perhaps a legitimate point of view. The reality is, given the history of Russia that I've just shared, and given the national psyche of Russia, as I said, the paranoia, the distrust they have, the desire they have to see competing political ideologies be brought down. With that mindset, we are frankly in a position where the thought of Russia all of a sudden becoming the friend of the U.S., the thought of them coming around fully and embracing the U.S. in these issues of such grave importance, the likelihood of that is 0 and nil, to be quite candid. It's just not in the cards. It's not in the national psyche of Russia, and it certainly is not in the psyche of Vladimir Putin. Again, he's an ex-KGB operative. He's a super spy of super spies, and those old tendencies die hard with someone like Vladimir Putin. You combine that with, frankly, the in my estimation, the ham-handedness of the Trump administration and the way they've attempted to go about thus far cultivating that relationship with Russia, and the lack of nuance of the Trump administration and Trump himself, the lack of historical perspective on the issue, the lack of, frankly, understanding of our own Constitution, the lack of understanding of the customs in that part of the world, the history in that part of the world. Again, I would say the likelihood of this administration, with its worldview, being able to successfully rebuild a bridge with a Russia that has the psyche that Russia has, especially with Putin being in charge of Russia, is between nil and 0. Now, given all that as context and given all that as grounding, let's take a look at Donald Trump. Now, a lot's been made of the fact that he has been summarily unwilling to call out Russia for its human rights abuses. He's been unwilling even to come to the conclusion that it was Russia, in fact, who attempted to interfere in the 2016 U.S. presidential election. When the Great Recession set in back in 2008 and nearly brought down the global economy, literally, and given the long history of bankruptcies that the Trump organization had experienced, especially in its casino businesses. If I'm not mistaken, they went bankrupt, I believe, 4 times, which I believe is the most times a given business interest has ever gone bankrupt in the history of the United States, literally. Tells you something about Trump's managerial and business skills. So, given that backdrop, and given the global economic meltdown that we experienced in 2008, and it got profoundly worse throughout that year into 2009, bankruptcies galore, closures galore, credit got as tight as could be. Credit was loose for years, which is part of the reason we got into that financial meltdown. So credit got tight. So Trump Organization, with its history of bankruptcies, its real sketchy history, was no longer able to get financing from most US-based financial institutions. So how do you solve that problem? You go outside the United States. Russia, as it turns out, was more than happy to jump into the breach and to put forward large lines of financing that in essence kept the Trump Organization, the Trump network of businesses, afloat. Now, Russia has a history of finding creative ways to influence high-profile business people in countries that they consider a threat to themselves. A person like Donald Trump, given his notoriety, given his wealth, given his position, given the audience and the media attention he commands, is a prime example of a target that Russia loves to cultivate. Now, there's a variety of ways in which Russia goes about cultivating relationships with folks such as Donald Trump. Some of them legal means, some of them illicit means. And from what I've come to believe and come to see is, there's, in some instances, Russia isn't entirely sure where that relationship is going to lead. They just know that they'd rather have that high-profile, high-net-worth individual from a foreign power that they consider to be an enemy on their side, rather than that not being the case. So, what happened over the course of time was an increasing financial dependence was built up on the part of the Trump Organization with Russia. Very heavy levels of investment. And I believe this is principally the reason why Donald Trump is adamant about not releasing his taxes. He's the first president in 40 years, since Nixon, I believe, who hasn't released their taxes. He said he would repeatedly on the campaign trail. He kept saying, when I become president, I'll release my taxes. Then he chose not to. There's a reason for that. My belief is that if we were to see Donald Trump's taxes, we would see extensive involvement with Russia from a business standpoint. We would see a mountain of financial entanglements between Trump Organization and Russia, either in terms of large amounts of debt outstanding to Russia, which I believe is the case, and or situations where there is common financial interest between the two of them, where Russia and the Trump Organization are uniquely benefiting from investments that they've made together. Now, that growing financial dependence on Russia on the part of Donald Trump over the time put him in more and more compromising position. He became more and more dependent on them for his financial well-being. Now, in the midst of all that, when the Obama administration was in power, there's a history there where, number one, Hillary Clinton, as Secretary of State under Barack Obama, fell in a very bad way with Vladimir Putin. She essentially became public enemy number one to Vladimir Putin. The reason for that is, several years ago, when there were uprisings that became to be known as the Spring Uprising, the Arab Spring, in a number of the Arab countries, Putin was concerned that those protests, those demonstration movements, would ultimately extend to Russia, and that his own population would rise up and turn against him, as was happening in the Arab countries. He felt that at that point in time that Hillary Clinton, by making what he perceived to be inflammatory public statements in support of the Arab revolutionaries, the Arab demonstrators, that she was in essence goading them on. And in essence, she was creating the potential where that protest movement would spread to Russia. So he looked at her as an enemy, increasingly as an enemy. Move fast forward a little bit in 2014, when Russia, as I mentioned earlier, invaded Crimea and Ukraine. The Obama administration, in retaliation, put very strict economic sanctions down on Russia. Very, very strict sanctions. Russia, for the better part of 2 decades under Vladimir Putin, had really been performing spectacularly in terms of economic growth, largely on the basis of their oil business, their oil exploration and development business. Once the sanctions came into play in 2014 on the part of Obama and Hillary Clinton, Russia's economy tanked, literally. Russia, my understanding is that the per capita income of the average Russian citizen has dropped by 40%, 40% since 2014, which is absolutely profound, and it's directly traceable to the sanctions that the U.S. imposed upon Russia. As a result, two things happen. Number one, Obama and Hillary Clinton, by extension, become the antichrist, if you will, to Vladimir Putin. They become, as I said, public enemy number one. Number two, the main objective of Putin and the Kremlin, the Russian government, became to have the sanctions lifted, to find a way, in essence, to have the sanctions lifted, because that's the only way they believed they would reclaim their economic independence, and they would get back on the economic growth plan, if you will. So, given all of that history, and given that political situation, increasingly, Vladimir Putin came to recognize that having Hillary Clinton as president, in his mind, would have been a total continuation of the Obama legacy, a perpetuation, a continuation of the sanctions. Things only would have gotten worse, in his estimation. As a result, the cultivation of the businessman, the private citizen Donald Trump, that the Russians had been engaged in for the better part of a decade, all of a sudden put into their lap a potential presidential candidate who, in fact, could be the anti-Hillary Clinton. So you have a situation here where Putin and Trump, their needs completely coalesced. Their needs completely came together. Vladimir Putin and Russia was there when Donald Trump and his organization were in need of financing. So they extended financing. Donald Trump starts to show presidential ambitions. Russia has been courting Donald Trump for an extensive period of time. They hate the fact that Hillary Clinton is going to be the Democratic candidate. So who better to support than Donald Trump to be the Republican candidate for president? Now, amidst all that, and as we've seen, a breadcrumb trail has clearly been laid out where a large number of the individuals around Trump, Team Trump, Paul Manafort, who was his former campaign manager, Carter Page, who was one of his foreign policy advisors early on in the campaign cycle, Jeff Sessions, who is now Attorney General, Michael Flynn, who became the national security advisor to Trump, even Jared Kushner, Trump's own son-in-law. These folks, it's increasingly being proven, have deep ties, in some cases deep financial ties to Mother Russia, in other cases deep political ties to Russia. In addition, the other folks in Trump's entourage, the familiar names, or the names that have become familiar to all of us now, Sean Spicer, the press secretary, Kellyanne Conway, who's been a key Trump spokesperson, Steve Bannon, who was one of his key advisors, a number of those individuals also have a breadcrumb trail that traces back. Kellyanne Conway in particular and Steve Bannon were with Breitbart News. Breitbart News is an extreme right-wing media organization that publishes very inflammatory, white supremacist, very anti-Semitic, racially charged type of news media. That's Breitbart News. Bannon came from Breitbart News. Kellyanne Conway and some others in the Trump sphere, including, I believe, Stephen Miller, came from Breitbart News. So they were brought together along with all these Russia-affiliated individuals to, in essence, create what became Team Trump. Now, Steve Bannon in particular, Steve Bannon has a very long history of very militant, nationalistic type of rhetoric, fairly anti-Semitic as well. Steve Bannon has gone on record to say that his objective in his role as advisor to Donald Trump is the deconstruction of the administrative state. What does that mean? Essentially, that means let's bring down the established order. The federal government is far too large. It's far too involved in people's lives. The federal government is regulating business and the common man up the wazoo. Enough is enough. Let's bring it down. Let's level this federal government thing and rebuild it. It's a very radical, very revolutionary philosophy that Steve Bannon has. And it very much is in concert with the ambitions of someone like Vladimir Putin, the ex-KGB operative, Cold War enemy of the United States. Vladimir Putin would love for the administrative state in America, in France, in Britain, in all the Western democracies to be deconstructed, to be brought down around our ears. That that really rings a bell for him in a very nice way. Those two philosophies really come together in the presence of Steve Bannon being one of the brains behind Trump's ascendance to the presidency, and Bannon's influence is clearly being felt most recently in Trump's renegade decision to pull the United States out of the climate change accord, the Paris Climate Accord. That's a perfect example of the nationalistic fervor of the Steve Bannon. Screw the rest of the world. We don't care about globalization. America for Americans, America first. Let the rest of the world suffer. We're going to go our own way, right? So you start to see a coming together here. The philosophies of Vladimir Putin, the historical state of mind and psyche of Russia, the financial needs of Donald Trump, and the point in time where the Trump campaign had reached a new low during the campaign cycle. His campaign was running on fumes at a point in time. And who came to the rescue at that point in time? It was Steve Bannon and Breitbart News. The extreme right wing began to support Donald Trump, and the Russians, who, as I said earlier, had cultivated Trump over the course of the better part of a decade. They came together with Trump to reinvigorate his campaign and to set him on a course that ultimately led to him ascending to the presidency. So where does that leave us? In future episodes of this podcast, we're going to get much more specifically into what the Russians did in the 2016 U.S. presidential election, how they did it, and how I believe the involvement, the meddling of the Russians in our election effectively swung the vote just enough to take it out of the Hillary Clinton column and put the win, in the Trump column. However, the one last path I want to go down here as regards Trump and where we're at right now in his ambitions. He's got this alliance with Russia, this profound alliance with Russia, in my estimation. He's got a vested interest in supporting Russia, in aligning with Russia, etc. I believe, apart from everything else I've talked about here, apart from the political and ideological issues that are at play, apart from the financial issues at play, and the enormous amounts of money that are there to be made, respectively, by Vladimir Putin, Russia, and by Donald Trump via collaboration on oil exploration and development deals, on military buildups, on massive tax reductions for businesses and for the wealthy. There's a lot of money to be made. Aside from all of those motivations for Trump and Putin to come together, I have a belief that apart from that, Trump has a personal ambition. Trump, from day one, has positioned himself as what? The consummate deal maker, the best deal maker history has ever known. If there's a deal to be done, I'm the guy that can get that deal done. That's been Donald Trump's mantra, as I think we're all well aware of. Think of the two deals that would be, from a geopolitical, from a historical perspective, what are the two deals that would be the toughest deals for somebody to broker? In my estimation, one is the U.S.-Russia relationship. Somebody who could come in after 50 years of Cold War, after a better part of a decade of stalemate between the U.S. and Russia as the two reigning superpowers in the world. If somebody could come in and broker a normalization of relationship between U.S. and Russia and put us on the same footing and have us collaborate, that would be an amazing deal for somebody to broker, right? Nixon tried it, Carter tried it, Clinton tried it, Obama tried it. Everybody's made an attempt to go down, but unsuccessfully. Russia's been, irredeemable, if you will. In steps Donald Trump. The other deal that would be possibly profoundly even tougher to broker than the deal between the U.S. and Russia would be Middle East peace. Mideast peace, right? My whole lifetime, I'm 55 years old, we've been talking about the potential for Middle East peace. The Palestinians, the Lebanese, the Israelis, the Syrians, the Saudis, etc., etc. It goes on and on. Imagine somebody could broker that deal, could bring peace to the Middle East, could normalize relations in the Middle East. In my estimation, Donald Trump, apart from everything else we've talked about, all the other illicit, sleazy, if you will, motivations that he's got for doing what he's doing, I believe there's a part of Donald Trump that thinks he can broker Middle East peace, number one. he could broker a normalization of relations and creating a set of good relations between the U.S. and Russia. I truly believe that. I think that was predominantly what motivated his first international trip. The first country he visited was Saudi Arabia. Then he went on to Israel. So there, he's clearly sending a message, olive branch, a fig leaf, if you will, attempting to insert himself into that situation and, in his estimation, quickly bring peace to the Middle East. And on the other side of the equation, the fact that he continues to make positive overtures to Russia, despite its human rights abuses, despite the long history of Russia that you would, that any U.S. president should be condemning them, he's chosen to do the exact opposite. I believe that is because he believes that his legacy to the world can ultimately be Middle East peace and establishing relations with Russia. I believe that he believes those would be his Emancipation Proclamation. What the Emancipation Proclamation was to Abraham Lincoln, what the New Deal was to FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Those are their respective legacies. I think Trump believes brokering Middle East peace and creating a sustainable relationship between the U.S. and Russia will be his New Deal, will be his Emancipation Proclamation. My belief is it's going to turn out to be the exact opposite. I think the attempts that Trump is making to do so, I think they're going to be his Monica Lewinsky. What Monica Lewinsky was to Bill Clinton, what Watergate was most directly comparable to Richard Nixon. That's the path I believe we're going down. And I think, unfortunately, when I look at Trump and the legacy he's going to leave, it's going to be much more Lewinsky and much more Watergate than it's going to be Emancipation Proclamation or a New Deal. Thank you for joining us for this episode. As I mentioned, we're going to continue to explore Russia. In our very next episode, we're going to look a lot more deeply as to what Russia did, how they meddled in the 2016 U.S. presidential election, and how things netted out and got us into in my estimation, the dire circumstances we're currently in. Again, tell us what you like about the series, what you don't like, give us feedback. Keep feeding us topics of interest to you. We'd like to build them in and make this a very interactive type of forum. This is Mark Millardi, and this is Unprecedented.